They were a scandal from April 1870 to May 1871, and then they were almost completely forgotten about, and they became a footnote to history. I don't really know why things happened in 1870. I think there was a sort of feeling of anxiety. There'd been revolutions in 1848. Europe was unstable, the world was unstable, the economy was unstable, and there were kind of creeping anxieties about sexuality, about sexually transmitted diseases, about the body, about contagion. And I think there was a feeling that, certainly if you read the newspapers, that androgyny, effeminacy was on the increase, that somehow or other the idea that men were men and women were women was kind of being subtly undermined. And I think it caused a cultural anxiety. And certainly I think the government, it's very clear that there was a conspiracy behind the decision to surveil, arrest and prosecute Fanny and Stella. And certainly the case went to Westminster Hall. It was a state trial with all the panoply of a state trial. The Lord Chief Justice presided, the Attorney General prosecuted. It was the first prosecution of a case of sodomy by an Attorney General in 240 years. So it was quite a big deal on the part of the government. And I do think that it was one of the first great set-piece battles of the modern age. 1870, a significant year, the first set-piece battle between sexual self-expression, between the idea of being free about your sexuality and the idea of a government repressing and clamping down on that. And that was a set-piece battle. Of course, ironically, Fanny and Stella were not revolutionaries. They didn't set out to challenge the political status quo. They were political with a small p and a large impact because they were just who they were. They didn't worry about why they liked to dress as women, why they liked to have sex with men, why they worked as male prostitutes. They just got on and did it joyously. And that's, of course, part of the attraction of Fanny and Stella, is they're such joyous, happy people. A lot of straight critics have read the book and said it's too camp and it's too explicit. And the gay critics who've read the book have said it's not camp enough and it's not sufficiently explicit. So you can't please all the people all of the time. What I wanted to do was to write about two very foolish young men who like to have a lot of sex, who like to go out and work as male prostitutes. Stella was arrested twice in the Haymarket before the third and big arrest and charged with, walking the streets with intent to sell sexual favors to men. And I wanted to write this story that did justice to them because they weren't serious. I didn't want to write a very dreary academic book full of 20th century and 21st century kind of analyses of sexuality. I wanted to write their story as they experienced it, based on absolutely the best evidence that I had. And in fact, apart from two occasions, I think, every piece of information used is a contemporary report. And I think that's very important. And so the book didn't write itself. I wrote the book, but I wrote the book in the knowledge, and it took me years and years to do, of who Fanny and Stella were. And I tried to make it slightly more a more straightforward, a more standard biography, and it didn't work. It wouldn't work for them because you can't write about extraordinary cross-dressing, drag queen, prostituting young men in a kind of normal way. So you have to write a book that somehow reflects their worldview and their vision. And I think there's something about truth and authenticity here, if I may just say that. I think there's an awful lot of very good biographies which are standard biographies, a sort of standard political biography of a Victorian giant, where you start at the beginning with the antecedents, you go through the birth, the childhood, the early struggles, the education, the politics, the letters, and you write this life, and it becomes an edifice, an erection, you might almost say. This wouldn't work for Fanny and Stella because they were ordinary and yet extraordinary people. We have perhaps, 40 or 50 letters from them. We have evidence from the trial transcripts and the depositions. We have evidence from their family and, circumstantial evidence, press reports, etc. What we don't have is this great, long literary life or political life that's full of documentation which you use to build a conventional biography. So I wanted to try and get to the truth of Fanny and Stella, and I hope I've succeeded. I mean, I'm not surprised that people have criticized the book, and I'm not surprised that people have torn it, from top to bottom. They've rent it and they've criticized me. I don't think there's a prescription for writing a non-fiction book. I think what you have to do, it's the intention of the author that's important, and whether or not you succeed in creating the kind of true, authentic story of the characters involved. And sometimes that's unconventional. And I think my book is unconventional, and I think it's a Marmite book. You either love it or you hate it. I think their story is wonderfully empowering and inspiring. I think they were brave and courageous, not because they set out to be brave and courageous, but because they were brave and courageous. And people have said, why were they brave and courageous? Well, they were brave and courageous because they were released on bail after their appearance in Bow Street Magistrates' Court and having been imprisoned and inspected by doctors. And instead of fleeing to the continent, they stayed and they came back to face this state trial in Westminster Hall. That's brave and courageous. If they'd been found guilty, they would have gone to prison for years and years and years. They'd have probably had hard labour, and they'd have probably died within a year or two, because people did. When Oscar Wilde went to prison for 2 years with hard labour, people wrote, well, this is a death sentence, that you die in prison when you have hard labour. So they were incredibly brave and courageous to come back, because there was no guarantee that they would get off. And there was every guarantee that the forces of reaction, the panoply of the state, the Lord Chief Justice, the Attorney General, all that stuff would weigh down upon them and annihilate them, and that they would be sentenced to prison. So I think that was brave and courageous. And I think they were brave and courageous simply by being who they were. And I think that the struggle of most people's lives, the struggle of my life, the struggle of many other people's lives, is to actually find out who they are, and not only find that out, but also express it and live it. And most people, I think it was Thoreau who said, live lives of quiet desperation. Fanny and Stella did not live a life of quiet desperation. They lived a life of highs and lows, theatrical highs, theatrical lows, of prostitution, penury, wealth, drama, excitement, and pure, utter, unadulterated camp. I think it's the Oxford English Dictionary says that the first use of the word camp was 1912. And actually it's not. The first use of the word camp, well, it's the word campish, was used in a letter from Fanny, from Frederick Park, to Lord Arthur Clinton, Stella's husband, in inverted commas. And Fanny was writing these arch letters, very flirtatious letters to Lord Arthur Clinton, and did eventually get him into bed, much to Stella's fury. And he wrote, "My campish undertakings are at present not meeting with the success they deserve." Well, that was 1868 or 1869. And you might say, well, why is the use of the word camp relevant? I think it's very relevant from a gay historical perspective. I mean, gay history generally is written by the victors. It's written by the powerful, the wealthy, the people who have won the wars, not the victims, the powerless, the poor. And so I think gay history has, by and large, been written by heterosexuals. It's been written in terms of psychiatric disorder, criminality, disease. So the use of the word camp in 1868, which was the first joyous use by a gay person, and then the OED saying, well, actually it wasn't used in 1912. Actually, there is a half century's difference, and I think that matters. And I could go on and on about why it matters, but I think it matters because I think my job as a gay historian and a gay person is to somehow reclaim gay history, to put it back together again, where it's been swept under the carpet, to lift the carpet and gradually sweep it out and sift through forensically through the fragments that are left, and somehow stick it back together again very carefully and very patiently to somehow reconstruct our lost history. People say, who did I write the book for? That's a common question. Well, there's no doubt about it. I wrote it for gay people. I wrote it for sexual minorities everywhere. I didn't really write it for straight people. And I'm quite happy if straight people want to buy it. I'm quite happy if they want to do it. I did suggest to the publishers that we should perhaps try and charge heterosexuals £2 or £3 more as a kind of differential, and then we could put the extra money into a reparation fund. The publishers didn't seem very keen on that. However, I'm still holding on to that idea. What was interesting was that, Fanny's father had not one but two gay sons. And, he put up bail when the oldest son, Harry, was arrested, and Harry fled and forfeited bail. And it's quite obvious that Judge Park, and he was a judge, would send Harry money and sustain him and protect him while he was on the run. And then he got up as a frail old man in very, very poor health and spoke up for his son Frederick. And the same was true of Mrs. Mary Ann Bolton, to the power of about 1 million, who was the original theatrical mother, who absolutely adored her son, wouldn't hear a word said against him, and somehow managed to sort of gloss over the kind of naughty bits of Stella's life and just present him as this lovely boy that had never done any wrong. And yes, of course she knew everything about it. Of course she knew that he was called Stella, and of course she'd help provide frocks for their amateur theatrics, and there was nothing sinister or horrible in it. And I think there were a lot of people like that. I don't think that the 19th century, that the Victorian age, was a monolith culturally or morally. And I think there were lots of people of liberal views, with tolerant views. And I think that's quite nice and quite exciting and quite encouraging. Although I think it's a terrible and dark chapter. And that the history of gay people has been a history of persecution, imprisonment, torture, execution, and violence, and that's not good. And my generation is perhaps the first generation of gay men that can stand up, have a civil partnership, and I don't need to apologize or to hide my sexuality from anybody or anything. And I think that's wonderful that we're here now. But we cannot forget the past, and we shouldn't forget the past. And it's very important to somehow reclaim the past for future generations of gay people.